Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Joseph Hooker, Fighting Joe Hooker, is remembered mainly for the Battle of Chancellorsville and his brief tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac at Chancellorsville. He's on the porch of the Chancellor House when a cannonball strikes the column, knocking him unconscious. And as a result, he is just not well remembered. However, there's so much more to Hooker, and I can't think of a better man, a better soldier to tell Hooker's story than James Fowler Rusling, who was one of Hooker's most loyal staff officers. Rusling heaps praise on Hooker in his 1899 book, Men and Things I Saw in Civil War Days. I want to share this assessment of Hooker with you. As I read it, listen for Rusling's explanation of the true origin of Corps badges in the Army of the Potomac and how Hooker did not really like his nom de guerre, Fighting Joe. So let's get into it. My next commander, Rusling says, and personally most beloved of all, was General Hooker, or Fighting Joe Hooker, as we used to call him. I first saw him in December 1861 when my brigade reported to him in Lower Maryland. He was already in command of a New England brigade and a New York brigade, and our brigade, 2nd New Jersey, completed his division. That became so well known afterward as the 2nd Division of the 3rd Corps, or simply Hooker's Division in the Army of the Potomac. General Hooker was then in the prime of manhood, with steel blue eyes, sandy hair, and clear-cut features, well set up but not corpulent, about 6 feet high, soldierly in his bearing and movements, and the beau ideal of a division commander. His talk was brilliant and incisive, and instinctively he impressed all who came in contact with him as an officer who knew what to do and how to do it, and confident of accomplishing it. I well remember his first inspection of our brigade and how thoroughly he overhauled us. It was on a bright Sunday morning in December 1861 at Rum Point, Maryland, opposite the Confederate batteries at Cockpit Point, Virginia. And as he went through us regiment by regiment, there did not seem to be a defect in a uniform or gun or knapsack or mule team that his eagle eye did not detect, nor a well set up officer or soldier that he did not compliment and praise. Hooker was a West Pointer. He had distinguished himself in Mexico, and it was fair to expect great things of him in the future. The winter of 1861-1862, he devoted to drill and discipline. Everybody had to toe the mark, and to winning the confidence and affection of his officers and men. It is easily safe to say that when we landed on the peninsula, that's the Virginia Peninsula, in the spring of 1862, there was no finer division in the Army of the Potomac. It approved itself at Williamsburg in May, where he received its baptism of fire. It distinguished itself at Fair Oaks in June, where it helped greatly to save the day. It marched and fought like a Macedonian phalanx or a Roman legion, with bent brow and firm front, in the memorable 7 days battle from front of Richmond to James River in June and July 1862. Indeed, in all the Peninsula Campaign, there was no hard marching or heavy fighting that Hooker did not participate in, and everybody felt that whatever else happened, his division at least was sure to be bravely and skillfully commanded. Hooker himself was always present on the field, alert and vigilant, conspicuously mounted on a white horse with flaming eyes, florid face, and high shirt collar that soon wilted down when we got engaged, but as cool and collected under fire as if directing on a parade or a picnic. In every engagement, he always seemed to know exactly what to do and when to do it. And it goes without saying, his men always went into action with alacrity and intrepidity, because they knew he would not put them in improperly or fight them blunderingly or imperil them unnecessarily. He was never ordered to attack that he did not obey promptly and intelligently. He was never called on for support that he did not respond cheerfully and gallantly, ever ready, ever willing and eager, always equal to the occasion. He never missed a battle or skirmish in the Peninsula Campaign when it was his duty to be present, and hence early acquired the sobriquet of Fighting Joe Hooker, and well deserved it. He did not fancy this himself, as he said it implied mere brute courage, whereas he claimed capacity for command. But the name nevertheless came and stuck all through the war, because it aptly described his surface characteristics, that is, his readiness to fight and ability as a fighter. When we were ordered back from the peninsula, Hooker's division was one of the first to reach Alexandria, Virginia, and heeding the call and distress of poor General John Pope and gallant Phil Kearny's division, hastened loyally to the front, while Porter, Fitzjohn Porter, and Franklin, William Buell Franklin's divisions, lagged lamentably behind. Had they moved as promptly as Hooker's and Kearny's, our second Bull Run might have resulted quite differently. Hooker, indeed, did not even wait for his private baggage, nor for the horses of his field and staff officers, but recognizing the great need of General Pope, marched at once to Warrenton and fought gallantly by his side at both Bristow and Manassas. Poor Kearny, peace to his ashes and tears to his memory, did the same and then fell at Chantilly the next day, but one afterward in the midst of a twilight reconnaissance on September 1st. But all the same, he baffled Lee's plans and headed off Stonewall Jackson on the march for Fairfax Courthouse, and thus saved our line of retreat to Alexandria and Washington. Hooker was deeply touched when he heard Kearny had fallen. They were close friends and dear to each other, and we were all whelmed in a common grief. He was our Chevalier de Bayard, the idol of his division and pride of the army, our Phil Sheridan of 1862, with a great career before him. I was only a short distance away when Kearny fell, and I think Chantilly, fought in an evening thunderstorm, was the saddest hour I saw in the service before the supreme tragedy of Lincoln's assassination. General Lee showed the gentleman and chivalrous foe he was by sending Kearny's body into our lines under a flag of truce on September 2nd, thinking the possession of his remains may be a consolation to his family. And in this, he only voiced the common sentiment of both armies towards the heroic Kearny. Subsequently, he also sent his sword, horse, and saddle by request of Kearny's wife. Hooker's division did not make the Antietam campaign. It was too much used up, but was left behind at Alexandria to recruit its thinned ranks and worn energies. Mr. Lincoln, however, would not dispense with Hooker himself, and so he promoted him to the command of the First Corps, Vice McDowell, relegated to Washington. That's Irvin McDowell. Here, General Hooker also quitted himself well, but was severely wounded and borne off the field in the very hour of victory. He was unable to report for duty again until we reached Falmouth in December 1862, but here he was assigned to the command of the Center Grand Division, 1/3 of the whole army, and still further demonstrated his ability by handling ably and skillfully at the bloody Battle of Fredericksburg. Hence, when, after Fredericksburg and the Mud March, Ambrose Burnside, was inevitably relieved, Mr. Lincoln naturally appointed General Hooker to succeed him. What else, indeed, was there to do? Kearny was dead, or doubtless he would have been called to the command. Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock, and Meade, George Gordon Meade, had not yet won their spurs. Sumner, Edwin Vos Sumner of the Right Grand Division, was too old and obstinate, and yet had never shown much head on his shoulders. Franklin of the left Grand Division had again shown only irresolution and indecision, if not disinclination, and therefore the only thing to do was to place General Hooker in command. He had some enemies, it is true, chiefly because of his sharp criticisms of McClellan, George B. McClellan, and Burnside, but he also had ardent and enthusiastic friends who believed in him thoroughly as both officer and man. And above all, he believed thoroughly in himself, and this, in military affairs, and in fact all human affairs, is often more than half the battle. General Hooker at once assumed command about February 1st, 1863, and none too soon. The Army of the Potomac was indeed then in a bad way. It had not been paid for 6 months. It had lost heavily in killed and wounded at Fredericksburg with no adequate results. Above all, it had lost its morale and was fast losing its organization. General Hooker officially reported he found nearly 3,000 officers and over 80,000 soldiers on the rolls absent or without leave. The Proclamation of Emancipation, just previously issued, while all right per se, had nevertheless caused bitter dissensions, particularly among the line officers, and these he quickly stopped by prompt court-martial and dismissal. I knew of many who publicly declared that they did not enlist to fight for, he uses the N word, he's talking about black men and black people, and they were going to resign and go home. But a few courts-martial soon ended all that. The desertions he cured by shooting to death with musketry in a few of the most flagrant cases, and then getting Mr. Lincoln to issue a proclamation of pardon to all who returned voluntarily to the ranks by a given date. Hooker devised a system of furloughs whereby all of us, in turn, might spend a few days at home. He abolished the clumsy organization by grand divisions, an invention of Burnside, more worthy of him, and returned to the simple and more effective organization by Army Corps as instituted by McClellan and practiced by Grant and Sherman. He invented the Corps badges, or rather, adopted the invention of poor Kearny, who first instituted them on the peninsula in order to identify his own troops as the Red Patch Division. And Hooker now wisely diversified and extended these to the whole army. My own division soon became known as the White Diamonds. Hooker increased and improved the rations. He set up brigade bakeries to give us fresh bread in lieu of hardtack. He re-equipped and reclothed all who needed it. He weeded out incompetent and unworthy officers. He looked sharply after everything that could make for drill and discipline and organization. He rode constantly through our camps and hospitals and among our batteries and wagon trains and saw everything that was going on and not going on. And thus it was not long before everybody felt that the eye and hand of a masterful commander was upon him. And so when, in May, with the Virginia dogwoods all in bloom, we set out for Chancellorsville, it was a common remark by shrewd observers that the Army of the Potomac was never in better heart and trim. At Chancellorsville, General Hooker's strategy was good, but his tactics failed. His plan, indeed, was excellent and his generalship of a high order until the surprise and rout of the 11th Corps, indifferently commanded by Howard and badly handled by Sigel, Schurz, and others, and his own grievous disability ruined everything. In the very crisis of battle, there in the very pinch of the campaign, while standing on the porch of the Chancellor House overlooking the hotly contested field, a Confederate cannonball struck a pillar of the porch against which he was leaning, and the pillar in falling knocked him senseless. I saw and talked with him myself shortly before this, and he was alert and confident as usual, but now he was unconscious or helpless for hours, dazed, half paralyzed, not a tithe of himself, just when his brain and hand were most required, and his next in command, Darius Cooch, knew not how to gather up the reins suddenly and direct the battle. Hence, things drifted, and hence we fought Chancellorsville by piecemeal and did not put in half our troops, and hence were worsted there, notwithstanding John Sedgwick's brilliant work down at Fredericksburg, when we ought to have won a great and telling victory. It is only comfort to me personally was that it brought me another promotion, Lieutenant Colonel and Chief Quartermaster of the Third Corps. I was in May 27th, 1863. But bad as Chancellorsville Rusling says, in some respects, it was really melancholy. It was nevertheless was not a blunder or a disaster like Fredericksburg. It baffled and defeated. At least we were not discouraged and demoralized, and soon were ready to try conclusions again with our Confederate friends. Grievous as were our losses, they did not begin to compare with Lee's, for he there lost his great lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson, his right arm hitherto, and was never able to replace him afterward. Hooker still held the respect and esteem of the army, if not its full confidence, and the masterly way in which he followed up and checkmated Lee in June 1863 from the Rappahannock to the Potomac in the beginning of the great Gettysburg campaign won our hearty admiration. Indeed, Hooker always claimed that Meade only followed out his plans substantially in fighting as he did at Gettysburg. It must be remembered that Meade was only 3 days in command before our great battle of Gettysburg, with much to learn in many ways, and had Hooker been there and succeeded so well, it is hardly credible that with his energy and self-reliance, Lee would have got back into Virginia again so easily after being whipped so thoroughly up there in Pennsylvania. I saw a good deal of General Hooker after he was relieved from command of the Army of the Potomac, and he always chafed bitterly over it and scolded much. But he did not sulk. He was still ready for duty there or elsewhere, and when, after Chickamauga, September 19th, 1863, Hooker was ordered west with the 11th and 12th Corps, soon after consolidated into the 20th, he showed his accustomed intelligence and energy by moving his entire command, over 20,000 strong, with their artillery, ammunition, baggage, etc., by rail from Washington, D.C. to Bridgeport, Alabama, nearly 1,000 miles in 6 days, a feat unparalleled during the war. He asked for me to accompany him. I was then serving inspector at Army headquarters, but Secretary of War Stanton, Edwin M. Stanton, was still angry with him and characteristically replied, "I will give General Hooker no more officers until he gets west and does something." Hooker then went in person to the White House, but Mr. Lincoln gave him a like reply, and so he went west. Here, he was prompt to report to Thomas, George Thomas, and Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, and did much to relieve Chattanooga and fought his famous battle above the clouds, the very poetry of the war at Lookout Mountain. His actual fighting at Lookout Mountain did not amount to very much, but it was scenic and dramatic above the clouds and gave him a worldwide and historic fame. In the spring and summer of 1864, Hooker participated actively in the great campaign and battles of General Sherman from Chattanooga to Atlanta, and there was hardly an important engagement from the Tennessee to the Chattahoochee that Hooker did not have a hearty and heavy hand in. His last battle was at Peachtree Creek in front of Atlanta, where the gallant McPherson fell, young in years but full of honors. Sherman now made the mistake, as I have always thought, of putting Howard in McPherson's place. Over the head of Hooker, his superior in rank as well as large military qualities, and Hooker unfortunately committed the still greater mistake, the error of his lifetime, by instantly resigning and retiring to Cincinnati. Howard, that's Oliver Otis Howard, then commanded the Fourth Corps and was commanding it as well. But he had failed Hooker at Chancellorsville, and I suppose Hooker, conscious of rectitude and of his own greater qualities, could not endure to see Howard, his junior in rank also, thus promoted over him. Of course, it was human to refuse to submit to such treatment, but it was not war nor good military politics that I think Hooker keenly regretted it always afterward. Unquestionably, Sherman was a little jealous of Hooker, or at least was not fair to him in this assignment of commands after his loyal and brilliant services both east and west. But all the same, Hooker would have stood better in history had he accepted the situation and fought through the war to its finish. Suppose he had stuck to it and gone on to Savannah and up through the Carolinas and been in at the final surrender of Joe Johnston and appeared in the Grand Review at Washington. He would have indeed been welcomed as Fighting Joe Hooker, and what an ovation he would have been given by the army and the nation. Altogether, I confess, I have always thought well of General Hooker and have tried to say it here. His intellect was of a high order, broad, keen, alert, vigorous, and what he did not know of the art of war and practical soldiering is hardly worth knowing. He was open and accessible to everybody, but he also knew how to assume authority and exercise command. One could not be long in his presence without feeling the mastery of his mind and will, while the charm of his manner was something indescribable. As a division commander, he certainly did have his superior in the Army of the Potomac. As a corps commander, his conduct at Antietam speaks for itself. As an army commander, he was unfortunate at Chancellorsville, but otherwise and elsewhere, he showed high military qualities, and I sincerely think deserves higher rank in history than he has hitherto received. In his later years, after the war ended, he was paralyzed both mentally and physically, and so was unable to right himself up in the Century and otherwise. That's the great Battles and Leaders series, as others did. Had he lived and been himself, unquestionably, we would have heard the other side of the story, for he held the pen of a ready writer. But all the same, he was a great and illustrious American soldier, and I dare to lay this tribute upon his grave. He was my comrade and good friend always, from 1861 to his decease, and I honored and loved him much. And every officer and soldier of Hooker's old division, at least, will hurrah him forever. So there you have it, the recollections of Joseph Hooker, Fighting Joe, though he apparently wasn't fond of that name, from one of his beloved staff officers. Thanks for listening. See you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.